The clock strikes 11:17 p.m. The air is thick, cold, metallic. Outside, a fine drizzle streaks down the cobblestone streets, reflecting the yellowish glow of the gas lamps and the outlines of military vehicles parked along the Wilhelmstrasse. Inside the gray building of the German Naval High Command, Oberkommando der Marine, the sound of typewriters and the repetitive click of boots echo through the corridors. On the building's rooftop, transmission antennas vibrate in the wind. Electromagnetic waves cross the night air, invisible, constant, infinite. The city sleeps. The empire seems unshakable, but amidst that silent symphony of noise and static, something changes. An anonymous frequency surfaces for seconds, breaking the spectrum's pattern. A brief hiss, a distorted murmur, and a voice, hoarse, sarcastic, full of contempt, speaks in perfect German. They think they command the destiny of the right, but the rats are eating inside the walls, and none of them notice the sound. The shift operator looks at the radio. The red light blinks. He jots down the frequency, 7.200 kilohertz. He pauses, hesitates, then writes only 2 words, "Suspicious signal." Downstairs, Admiral Eric Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, reviews reports from the North Atlantic fleets. His hands rest on maps of naval routes and submarine positions. The war at sea seems favorable. U-boats dominate the waters, hunting British convoys with deadly precision. In the distance, a subordinate mentions something about pirate transmissions. Raeder laughs, a dry, brief laugh, almost arrogant. He says, "British propaganda, useless noise, nothing that changes the course of the war." The radio in the corner of the room hisses once more. For an instant, an irregular sequence of high-pitched sounds and rhythmic beats fills the air. It sounds like mere interference, but it is not.
It is the beginning of something no one in that building comprehends. That technical fault, an unauthorized signal emitted by a transmitter outside the laws of war, would mark the birth of the first invisible weapon of information in World War II. And the empire that prided itself on controlling every voice would ultimately fall because of a voice that officially did not exist. This is Gustav Siegfried Eins, speaking from inside the heart of the Reich. And you know nothing. The shortwave travels across the continent, bouncing between ionized clouds, reaching coastal cities, barracks, and naval bases. German operators record the frequency, intrigued. The speaker seemed to be a patriot, a German outraged by his own officers. The message was confusing but powerful, a mixture of truth and insult, like a confession transmitted to the wind. On that night, no one noticed, but a single broadcast, born of daring and engineering, would expose the German Navy's greatest secret. And what began as an illegal radio trick would transform the tide of the war in the Atlantic. The city lights flicker. Distant thunder cuts the sky. The signal disappears. Silence. What they didn't know was that on that night, they were witnessing the beginning of their own end. In 1940, all of Europe seemed to speak German. From Paris to Warsaw, the radio waves echoed speeches of victory and promises of an eternal empire. But across the English Channel, deep inside a stuffy, cable-filled basement, a small group of engineers, journalists, and German exiles was plotting a plan that defied all military logic of the time. It would not be a firearm, nor a submarine. It would be a voice.
London, autumn 1940. The Luftwaffe bombs fell almost every night. While the world took shelter in the subway tunnels, something that official reports would call an offensive psychological propaganda initiative via radio broadcasting was being born deep within the political warfare executive building. In other words, an illegal wartime radio. In command of the project was an unconventional man, Sefton Delmer, a British journalist born in Germany, former Daily Express correspondent in Berlin. He knew the language, the accent, the soldiers' slang, and the officers' fears. Delmer had been close to Hitler during the Reich's early days. He knew how he thought, and more importantly, what his men believed. "If we are going to hurt them," Delmer would say, "it won't be with bombs, it will be with doubts." His plan seemed impossible: to create a clandestine radio that appeared to be German, but was actually operated by the enemy. The idea: deceive the Germans themselves with a false but plausible voice that broadcast from within the Reich, denouncing corruption, betrayal, and internal decay. It was a dangerous gamble. The Geneva Conventions prohibited deceptive broadcasts within enemy territory. Even in wartime, this would be illegal, a weapon outside the rules. But the war Delmer saw had no rules. The first prototype. At the transmission lab in Woburn Abbey, BBC and British Army engineers tested the first frequencies. Copper antennas were suspended over makeshift masts. High-voltage cables crisscrossed the ceiling like spider webs. The problem was twofold: create a signal strong enough to reach cities like Hamburg and Berlin, but weak enough so as not to sound like it was coming from abroad, something a German home radio would believe was local. The initial tests failed miserably. The voice was metallic, the timbre too British. The frequency, 7.200 kHz, leaked interference from military transmissions, and worse, the sound fluctuated, betraying a distant origin. Engineer Reginald Jones, a counterintelligence specialist, described the scene in a report. The signal sounded like a foreigner trying to fake a German accent and failing. It was a false voice in a world of real lies. But Delmer did not give up. He gathered exiled broadcasters, anti-Nazi Germans who had taken refuge in London. Among them, a Berlin theater actor known only as Der Chef, the boss, who would later become the iconic voice of the Gustav Siegfried I project, or GS1.
The birth of Gustav Siegfried I. The radio would be presented to the public as an ultra-nationalist patriotic station, run by a mysterious and supposedly influential German, a man who championed the Reich but scorned the corrupt people within it. "We do not speak against Germany," Der Chef's voice said in the tests. "We speak against those who dishonor her." It was brilliant. GS1 would be the wolf in sheep's clothing. It would sound loyal, but it would attack the heart of the system. The script was carefully planned. True news, obtained from public sources and espionage. Internal critiques, aimed at specific officers, using real names and ranks. Personal innuendo to sound like inside gossip. Dirty humor to capture the attention of the common people. Every word was measured with surgical precision. Every pause, every microphone hiss was part of the illusion. Delmer insisted on something crucial: authenticity through chaos. The British wanted a clean audio, but he ordered the addition of glitches, distortion, and static, the real sound of a clandestine broadcast. Perfection betrays. The error is what convinces. The first transmission. On May 23, 1941, at 5:45 p.m., the transmitter operator at Crowborough, southeast England, received the order: activate GS1, frequency 7.2 MHz, power 60 kilowatts. The red light came on. The sound of scratching vinyl was heard, and Der Chef's voice emerged from the shadows. Gustav Siegfried Eins speaking here. I am a German soldier, and I tell you, the party is rotting from within. Within minutes, the signal crossed the English Channel, ricocheted off the ionized clouds over Belgium, and fell over Germany. Naval operators picked up the sound. Interception stations registered the frequency. The noise was clear, the tone aggressive, but something went wrong.
Technical failure. The broadcast suffered interference from a state propaganda station in Frankfurt. The voice distorted, the sound dropped, the signal died. For 2 days, British technicians tried to find the point of resonance again. The transmitter overheated. The main cable burned out. The BBC technical report summarized, failure due to valve overload and inadequate amplifier synchronization. Project suspended until further notice. The team was exhausted. Some wanted to abandon the idea. Others feared diplomatic retaliation if the Reich discovered the source of the transmission. But Delmer smiled, tired, yet convinced. Is it a failure? Yes, but it's the right failure because the enemy heard it. Days later, reports intercepted by the British Secret Service confirmed the Reichssicherheitsdienst, Reich Security Service, had heard the signal. They classified it as an emitter of unknown, potentially internal origin. It was the first German mistake, the first step in a perfect trap. Inside Germany, civilians and soldiers began to tune in to the frequency out of curiosity. The content seemed forbidden, and everything forbidden attracts. In bars, soldiers whispered, "Did you hear Gustav? He says what no one else dares to say." The fake radio was coming to life. With every new broadcast, the public increasingly believed that their chef was a real rebellious officer. Goebbels' machine, accustomed to controlling the truth, did not know what to do with such a well-constructed lie.
Behind the scenes of the mechanism. In the PWE laboratories, engineers worked day and night. Every technical detail was fine-tuned. Modulation phase adjusted to 7.3 kHz to avoid interference from the Frankfurt towers. Dynamic compression altered to simulate German Telefunken radio microphones. Addition of room noise, the natural echo of a small studio, to make it sound domestic. Insertion of small pauses and coughs between sentences to humanize the announcer. The result? A perfect auditory illusion. Der Chef's voice became so authentic that even Wehrmacht technicians responsible for detecting enemy transmissions believed it to be an internal signal. A German report dated June 1941 said, "Source unknown, but discourse aligns with conservative criticism of the party. No signs of British propaganda. We recommend discreet investigation." Delmer guffawed when he read it. He believed it. He truly believed it. The impact of GS1 began to surpass the field of espionage. It was a psychological weapon, and like any new weapon, few understood its strength.
While the British saw only a tool of propaganda, Delmer saw something bigger: the possibility of destroying a nation's morale from the inside out with a voice that seemed to come from its own cellars. The term he coined in internal reports was black propaganda, propaganda that pretends to be from the enemy to undermine it. Unlike the official BBC broadcasts, which used facts, statistics, and high morale, GS1 used emotional poison: anger, sarcasm, envy, and scandal. Der Chef accused generals of adultery, officers of corruption, ministers of luxury, while soldiers died. He mixed truths with lies, but the lies seemed more credible than any fact. And so, night after night, the illegal radio continued, broadcasting from British soil, yet sounding as if it sprang from the heart of Berlin. The technicians called the transmitter the monster. A block of steel and valves that shook when the power surged. The coils hummed. The air smelled of ozone and hot grease. The chief operator, a former BBC engineer named Peter Eckersley, wrote in his diary, "When the red light comes on, I feel like we are tearing open a wound in the heart of Germany. We don't drop bombs, but our words cross the channel and explode in silence." There were nights when the transmitter failed, others when the signal reflected off the ionosphere and fell into neutral territory. But somehow the message always got through. And meanwhile, in the corridors of the German Ministry of Propaganda, Goebbels gnashed his teeth. "An enemy in the ether," he said, "a voice that speaks with a German accent and injects doubt. Finding it is a top priority." But they never found it. They never discovered that the voice came from the hills of southern England. They never imagined that the monster was British. For months, British engineers fought against failures, interference, and threats. With every broadcast, they risked exposing their origin. But they did not stop, because they knew that voice, illegal, hidden, and stubbornly persistent, had become the spark of something much bigger. No one imagined that this apparent failure carried the germ of victory.
On June 17, 1941, a classified report crossed the borders of Germany. It was just a sheet of paper, but for the ears of the Kriegsmarine, Hitler's mighty war navy, that simple document would become the harbinger of a nightmare. The anomalous transmission on 7.200 kHz was picked up again. The content is disturbing, insulting to the party. We recommend the immediate suspension of all mobile antennas on the north coasts. The signal was not just a technical error. It was a direct challenge to Hitler's war machine. Der Chef's voice was no longer confining itself to veiled insults. Now he was attacking the essence of the Reich. When soldiers march to war, they know the sacrifice is great. But why sacrifice the soul of our homeland? Why allow vermin and thieves to govern while the people die in the trenches? The line between subversive propaganda and insurrection was now dangerously thin. In Berlin, Goebbels, who had spent weeks laughing at the operation, began to realize the psychological impact of the clandestine broadcast. The chef's voice seemed simple, but it struck at the core of the regime's trust. Internal reports indicated that every day more soldiers and civilians tuned in to the radio. At 20-minute intervals, German transmitters began to suffer interference. And the Kriegsmarine High Command, officers gathered around a table where maps of the Atlantic coasts were spread out. Admiral Raeder, in one of his meetings, discussed what could be the true source of the signal. This cannot be an accident. If it is British, they are starting to understand how to manipulate us. Meanwhile, a new report from the U-boat commander in the North Atlantic arrived. The crews are listening. The transmission reached us yesterday. They do not seem convinced it is British propaganda. On the contrary, it sounds much closer to the truth than we would like to admit." The signals continued to infiltrate the Navy's communications. Even a U-boat commander, while surfacing to refuel, reported, "I heard them while navigating in broad daylight. The chef's voice, it is everywhere now." The Navy and the High Command were finally aware of the invisible threat. What had started as a joke or curiosity had become a direct affront to the morale of the Empire. In London, the PWE celebrated the initial success. But what they did not know was that the war on another front, the war of the radio waves, was about to take a new turn. During the night of June 19, the main transmitter, one of the monstrous 60-kilowatt machines, began to overheat.
The valve system failed. The noise of German interference was heard throughout the south of England. For a moment, the signal disappeared. The engineers panicked. The PWE ordered the installation to be repaired as quickly as possible. If the Reich found and silenced the GS-1 signal, all the effort, all the risk of months of operation could be lost. "This is the most critical moment of the operation so far," one of the technicians wrote in his report. "If we cannot re-establish the signal, the entire mission will be lost. We cannot fail." The British technicians, in a hurry, began the repairs. The tension mounted. Every second that passed without the active signal increased the risk of exposure. The illicit radio, which had taken shape as a simple espionage trick, was now transforming into a matter of life and death for the Allies. It was during one of those nights, while the cooling system was failing and the valves were overheating, that an improvised solution was proposed by a field engineer, Reginald Jones. What if, instead of a static transmission, we used a mobile transmitter, a radio that was not stationary, that did not have a fixed location? The idea of a mobile station was considered revolutionary. Instead of relying on a single transmitter, the British would start moving, changing position whenever the Reich began to track the signal. If a U-boat could move without being caught, why not a radio?
Soon after the attempt to silence the GS-1 transmitter, the Kriegsmarine Command ordered a drastic action: the interception and destruction of any British signal operating on the 7.200 kHz band. New orders were sent to destroy British transmitters on French soil. The confrontation in the War of Radio Waves intensified. The Reich had already dedicated considerable resources to combat the clandestine broadcasts and protect the purity of internal information. Secret Kriegsmarine Report. Instructions have been given to coastal commands and submarines. The priority is to find and destroy the point of origin of the unknown frequency. The technological and information war was beginning to demand more than just weaponry. Now transmissions were an invisible battlefield where the winner would control the narrative and the morale of their troops. When GS-1 returned to the air on June 24, 1941, the British were ready. The mobile transmitter had been assembled and adjusted to a new security frequency. The signal was strengthened and broadcast from different points in the country. Now, even if one transmitter was located, the rest of the network remained intact. The first victory of the Allies was invisible. The Reich, once again, was deceived. While the British recovered from the technical failure, the German Navy began to feel the psychological effects of the invisible war. Sailors at coastal bases, who were already facing constant air attacks and the strain of prolonged warfare, now began to doubt their leaders. "I heard the voice again yesterday. It speaks as if it were one of us. Are they hiding something?" a U-boat radio operator reported. The sailors began to question. The civilians began to wonder. The regime was finally being undermined from the inside out. The battle of the radio waves was far from over. But that initial failure, that first mistake,
That first confrontation with the reality of the invisible war had planted the seed of doubt within the Kriegsmarine itself, and thus the invisible monster continued to grow.
Soon after the attempt to silence the GS-1 transmitter, the Kriegsmarine Command ordered a drastic action: the interception and destruction of any British signal operating on the 7.200 kHz band. New orders were sent to destroy British transmitters on French soil. The confrontation in the war of radio waves intensified. The Reich had already dedicated considerable resources to combat the clandestine broadcasts and protect the purity of internal information. Secret Kriegsmarine report. Instructions have been given to coastal commands and submarines. The priority is to find and destroy the point of origin of the unknown frequency. The technological and information war was beginning to demand more than just weaponry. Now, transmissions were an invisible battlefield where the winner would control the narrative and the morale of their troops. When GS-1 returned to the air on June 24, 1941, the British were ready. The mobile transmitter had been assembled and adjusted to a new security frequency. The signal was strengthened and broadcast from different points in the country. Now, even if one transmitter was located, the rest of the network remained intact. The first victory of the Allies was invisible. The Reich, once again, was deceived. While the British recovered from the technical failure, the Kriegsmarine began to feel the psychological effects of the invisible war. Sailors at coastal bases, who were already facing constant air attacks and the strain of prolonged warfare, now began to doubt their leaders. "I heard the voice again yesterday. It speaks as if it were one of us. Are they hiding something?" a U-boat radio operator reported. The sailors began to question. The civilians began to wonder. The regime was finally being undermined from the inside out. The battle of the radio waves was far from over. But that initial failure, that first mistake, that first confrontation with the reality of the invisible war had planted the seed of doubt within the Kriegsmarine itself.
The radio was not just a voice. It was the first significant flaw in the German propaganda machine. Goebbels, the master of mass manipulation, began to feel powerless. He, who shaped the reality of his people, had no control over what the Germans themselves were hearing. This war in the ether now belonged to the British. The British, in turn, had a new problem. Now they knew the enemy was listening, but at the same time they could not stop. GS-1 could not fail. Time and the morale of the war was against them. The war of the radio waves was far from over. The silent world was about to be shaken by the true force of Gustav Siegfried I. But until then, the price of failure was high. GS-1 almost disappeared. It was almost silenced. But, as always, the enemy underestimated the power of the voice. On that same night, July 6, 1941, Gustav Siegfried I returned to the air with clockwork precision. The relentless British engineers had rebuilt the station with a new plan. A series of secure, mobile transmissions jumping from frequency to frequency with a new coding system that made detection by the Kriegsmarine difficult. However, what most troubled the Reich's officials was not the radio's interference. What truly terrified them was the psychological effect it was causing. The myth of the German Navy's invincibility, built with sweat and sacrifice for years, was beginning to unravel. Now, on the darkest nights of the Atlantic, in lonely naval bases and among the U-boat crews, the chef's words reverberated like a great lie the Germans had told themselves.
The weakening of the foundations. Der Chef's voice was now beginning to hit the tipping point. Initially, sailors, pilots, and officers merely laughed suspiciously at the broadcasts. "It's just British propaganda," some said. They are just voices of the opposition, others thought. But with every new broadcast, more and more ears were open to the mysterious voice. Now, internal criticism, doubt, and distrust were taking shape as a true, invisible weapon. Listeners who were once faithful to the Führer began to question the information they received. Der Chef's pronouncements began to seem truer than the promises of victory coming from the high command. The change in minds. What was once simple subversion was now becoming a phenomenon on a global scale. Inside the German bases in northern France, soldiers began to debate the words they heard. "I listened last night," Der Chef said, "that our troops are dying for no purpose," an officer said, looking suspiciously at his colleagues. "But he's right. How can we fight a war we already know we can't win? Where are our victories?" Tensions began to explode internally. In the trenches, in the daily life of the submarine bases, doubts began to arise with increasing force. The war no longer seemed to be a fight between nations, but a struggle for truth. And who was starting to tell the truth? The one who claimed to be the enemy, or the regime that had sold a monumental lie to its people? The impact of clandestine truth. In the wreckage of the Nazi war machine, among the bundles of its rusty gears, something was breaking, and it wasn't the steel, nor the tanks or planes. It was credibility. One July night, off the coast of occupied France, one of the largest U-boat fleets was preparing to attack a new Allied supply line. But something changed. Before heading to sea, the naval officers were listening to the radio, GS-1. That night's message was particularly sharp. The Reich is no longer a nation of warriors. It is rotting from within. When your navy no longer hears the ocean winds, it is a sign that the tides of war have already turned. The sacrifice of our men has become a farce. There was silence. Not a simple pause, but a mental paralysis. The sailors and commanders began to question. Der Chef's voice not only challenged the high command, but also questioned their own beliefs. For many, it was a moment of rupture, a true invisible turning point. The war no longer seemed to be only physical, it now had a much larger psychological dimension.
The Great Deception. The game was now more dangerous. The enemies were no longer on the battlefields, but inside the very minds of their own soldiers. At the Kriegsmarine headquarters, Goebbels, sleepless for days, read the Navy reports. The reports said, "The loyalty of the officers is beginning to be questioned. The morale of the sailors is in near total collapse." He looked at the data and knew the situation was becoming critical. The empire was being devoured from within, not by British bombs, but by words. Goebbels angrily ordered the intensification of jammers, the interference emitters that were trying to crush the radio. But the problem was that the British transmitter was moving, jumping from frequency to frequency. It was impossible to track it. Der Chef did not care about Goebbels' efforts. He knew he was achieving something much deeper and more crucial. The truth cannot be silenced by radio waves, Der Chef thought. The invisible resistance. The British, meanwhile, realized that the radio waves were achieving something no bombardment or military offensive could. They were fragmenting the Reich's trust from the inside out. It was a war of information, and GS-1 had become the invisible enemy that the Reich could not defeat. Radio waves were the new battlefield, and the people, in silence, were now playing the cards of truth. The Kriegsmarine felt the pressure mounting. The vessels began to prepare for a new kind of confrontation, not just on the high seas, but within their own minds. And so, with every GS-1 broadcast, more and more members of the German naval force began to doubt their cause. The war, which seemed immortal, was slowly disintegrating before what for many was the greatest invisible threat of all.
The enemies were there, before us. Not the tanks, not the bombs, but the doubt, the lies, and, most importantly, the truth. The German War Navy, considered unbeatable, was losing the silent battle. A battle not fought at sea, but in the minds of those who believed in it. The invisible turning point that many thought impossible was now happening. And those who were losing were not just an army, it was an entire nation. GS1 was no longer just a clandestine broadcaster. It was a symbol of resistance, a resistance that crept through the corridors of the Reich, crossing the shadows, revealing the rot, and exposing the fragility of the empire. And so the invisible war continued, now with more force than ever. The invisible battle of words had begun. The German Navy was divided. Goebbels' propaganda system could no longer control everything. And the greatest enemy of all, doubt, was being planted in the minds of men who, until then, believed the empire was unbreakable. GS1 was not just a trick. It was a monster, a machine that would swallow the empire from the inside out.
The escalation of terror. By August 15, 1941, Gustav Siegfried Eins had become a household name within the corridors of the Kriegsmarine. Although he was never seen, the echo of his voice resonated through the officers' halls, the U-boat officers' cabins, and the crew's dormitories. Hitler's navy, once a terrifying war machine, now found itself under attack by a weapon that could not be countered with bombs or cannons. Panic in the corridors of the Kriegsmarine. The first sign of panic within the Kriegsmarine was subtle, like a nervous vibration, a slight tremor in the legs of a giant machine. The presence of GS1 in the most remote outposts of the German Navy became clear. The initial reaction was typical, disdain. A communication glitch, said frontline commanders. Dirty British propaganda, others said. Something of minor importance, muttered the high-ranking officers. But as the broadcasts continued, in greater number and with increased intensity, the Navy could no longer ignore them. Doubt inevitably infiltrated the sailors themselves, and, more frighteningly, the high-ranking officers. The effect was cumulative. U-boat after U-boat, officers and crews began to question not only the command, but also the justice of the war. A U-boat commander wrote in his diary, "I listened to the broadcast last night, a harsh critique of the command. I no longer know if I believe we are doing the right thing. The Reich always promised us victory. But what is this war if the very leaders are rotting from within?" The sentiment that was once a small shadow grew into a larger shadow with every new GS1 broadcast. It was an invisible war, a terror on the radio waves that carried doubt as its only power.
The world hears. The Reich feels. In Berlin, the tension was becoming palpable. GS1's broadcasts began to be recognized as something beyond mere propaganda. They became phenomena of distrust, and there was no way to reverse them. In a secret meeting at the Ministerium for Volksaufklärung and Propaganda, Goebbels' propaganda ministry, the minister himself, his eyes red from exhaustion, began to perceive the seriousness of the situation. "What we are hearing is not just an external fallacy, it is a fissure in the heart of our people," Goebbels said. "The Navy and the soldiers believe the radio's words. We are not dealing with an external enemy, but with an internal enemy that undermines our morale." At the command table, reports began to accumulate, increasingly detailed. The number of calls from troops on the front lines mentioning GS-1 is growing. Many no longer know what is real and what is propaganda. We can no longer filter the information. Goebbels was, for the first time, without answers. The Navy no longer saw the radio waves as mere interference. Every clandestine broadcaster now seemed to take control of the souls and minds of its own soldiers. The explosion of psychological fear. The most surprising thing was the psychological impact on the front lines. Soldiers and sailors who were accustomed to fighting on physical fronts now found themselves fighting a mental war against something they could not see but could hear, and the worst, they could not silence it. Throughout the coast of northern Europe, where U-boats patrolled, the sound of Der Chef invaded every man's mind, making them question not only the military command, but the regime itself. When you hear that, it feels like the Führer and his officers have been lying to you for a long time. It's a signal. They know what's happening, but they are not telling the truth. Doubt grew. Reports of disobedience began to surface among U-boat crews. One of them, submerged in the Atlantic, had written, "We are navigating without direction. Where is our real mission? Why are we doing this? What are we gaining?" In the Battle of the Atlantic, morale is as important as the bullet, and when morale begins to erode, hands tremble when pulling the trigger.
The spiral effect, the Navy disintegrating from within. The internal disintegration was swift, no longer in months or weeks, but in days. Kriegsmarine officers began to see their own troops as an unreliable force. What started as a small act of psychological disobedience now threatened the entire chain of command. At a naval base in the Frisian Islands, a meeting of officers was recorded. One of the men, a U-boat commander, said, "If we want to win this war, we have to know where we are going. Or are you going to keep pushing men to their deaths for no reason?" In his mind, he had already decided. There was no more trust. The great empire was crumbling from within. The world hears. The Reich blinds itself. While the Navy began to fragment, the Reich's high command took desperate measures. The use of jamming was intensified. Attempts to find and destroy the GS-1 transmitter became a top priority. But the problem now was more than just interfering with the signal. Goebbels and the high commanders already knew that, with every attempt to drown out the signal, rejection of the Reich grew. The invisible weapon had a power far greater than anyone could imagine. It was not just a matter of physical control. It was a war of minds, and the Reich was losing. The last stand. As the radio waves crossed occupied France, the Netherlands, and the Reich itself, doubt turned into resistance. In France, members of the resistance began to listen to Der Chef and feel more confident. They were no longer alone. They knew that the words disguised as propaganda were in fact the truth. The first waves of resistance began to gain more strength. GS-1's message spread to the heart of the Reich and beyond. The regime could no longer silence what was already in the hearts of millions. The mind of the people was, for the first time, being challenged.
The real impact on the battlefield. By September 1941, the German Navy was facing growing distrust among its officers and crews. In the battle in the Atlantic, where U-boats and British warships faced off, the psychological fear was palpable. A generation of men who considered themselves invincible was beginning to succumb to an invisible enemy, a voice in the air that, however distant, had the power to change the war. What began as a simple signal turned into a cry of resistance. The war of the radio waves was more than just a matter of transmission. It destroyed the pillars of confidence of the world's greatest war machine. Now psychological terror had a name: Gustav Siegfried I.
The German Navy was no longer fighting against external enemies, but against what was already in their own hearts. And the worst enemy in war was no longer an army. It was doubt. The doctrine of power. Between October 15th and November 20th, 1941, something was changing at the core of the war. What once seemed to be a simple subversion campaign by a clandestine radio station was silently transforming into the great battlefield of World War II. GS-1, the name few in the Reich could identify, but everyone now feared, was more than just a propaganda weapon. It was a doctrine of power. The War of the Waves was not just about who broadcast the message, it was about who controlled the perception. The invisible war, mind against mind. In Berlin, the Reich finally understood that it was no longer fighting a military enemy. It was not just British submarines, bombers, or ground forces. Not anymore. The enemy was now the perception of truth. It was psychological fear. It was the mind of the soldier, the officer, and the civilian from Berlin till Lviv and from East Prussia to Vienna. In his war room, Goebbels, the master of propaganda, watched as his greatest tool of control, the manipulation of the masses through information, disintegrated before his eyes. Doubt was growing. The truth, or what appeared to be the truth, was now coming not from Berlin, but from London, from a clandestine station, a German voice that accused the party of treason.
The War of Information. GS-1 had indeed become a powerful weapon, a tool for ideological rupture. The impact was no longer just psychological. It was reshaping the war itself, changing the rules of the conflict. Goebbels' internal report. The power of the word has never been so clear. We are now at war not only for territories or peoples, but for minds. Our soldiers, our children are listening to this voice. And they are beginning to question. On the battlefront, German Navy commanders began to question themselves. Where are we? Are we defending our homeland, or are we sustaining a collapsing empire? Der Chef's words echoed in the brains of every soldier, every sailor, every officer. When you fight, fight for something more than a regime. Fight for the truth. These words reverberated like the echo of despair inside the souls of the men who were on the fighting fronts. The lie and the truth, an ideological confrontation. The German Navy, which once believed in an absolute victory, began to realize that the true war was not on the ocean, but in the control of truth. The men on the battlefield began to question whether they were fighting for the righteousness of the Reich, or if they were merely being used to maintain a regime that no longer presented true ideals. Narrator, deep, crescendoing tone. The control of information became, in those weeks, the most powerful weapon of the Reich. But the very control of truth was slipping from the hands of Goebbels, and ultimately from the Führer himself. In their meetings, officers tried to argue with Goebbels, trying to ease the situation. It's just a momentary glitch. They will forget. But Goebbels knew that doubt once planted could not be uprooted. Those who have control of the mind have control of the war, Goebbels repeated.
The creation of the invisible enemy. While the Reich struggled to maintain control, the PWE, the British Psychological Warfare Executive, intensified its operations. With GS-1 becoming increasingly effective, they began to realize that they were not just creating an invisible enemy, but an invisible ideology that undermined the Reich from within. GS-1 was more than a propaganda weapon. It became a symbol of ideological resistance, a symbol that the truth could be transmitted through hidden means without the need for physical weapons. Truth, in turn, had become the most effective weapon in psychological warfare. The war we are now fighting is a war of words and souls, declared Sefton Delmer, one of the project's creators. By using psychological fear, the PWE knew they were shaping something much bigger than a simple radio broadcast. The fall of the Wall of Lies. In November 1941, the Reich Command finally ordered a total crackdown against any kind of unauthorized transmission. New jamming plans were put into effect, but the problem was that GS-1 transmitter was already moving. Broadcasts jumped between frequencies and locations. For Goebbels, the attack was no longer against a simple clandestine broadcaster. It was an attack against the foundations of the Reich. Inside the Kriegsmarine, sailors began to view their orders with skepticism. On the Mediterranean front, a U-boat commander wrote in his diary, "The war is no longer just at sea. The war is inside our minds. We are beginning to fight against ourselves." This was one of the first clear signs that the Navy was no longer completely trusting the command system. Doubt had already infiltrated the minds of its men.
The ideological contagion. GS-1's power was no longer just about broadcasting false information or distorted news. Now, it was an entire ideology being spread like a mental virus that invaded even the hearts of those who never questioned the Reich. GS-1's power lay in its ability to transform words into actions. What was once a war machine with a clear objective, total victory, was now being undermined internally. What men hear, what they believe, was changing the course of the war. The fight for the collective mind. GS-1's goal now was not just to defeat the Reich physically. The battle was over who controlled the collective mind of the German people, the soldiers, and the officers. While Goebbels desperately tried to silence the truth, resistance strengthened in the shadows. GS-1 was no longer just a transmitter, but a doctrine of power. A doctrine that challenged not only physical weapons, but the very essence of war. A war where information became as valuable as any tank or plane. GS-1 had become much more than a simple radio broadcast. It was a war for the soul of Germany. The Reich was not just losing control of the radio waves, it was losing control of the truth, and whoever controlled the truth now held the power of the war.
The Final Judgment. On January 15, 1942, Hitler's war navy, with all its strength, suffered its greatest defeat. But it would not be in the cold waters of the Atlantic or the African desert. It would be, instead, on the radio waves. An invisible field where silence would be more lethal than any bullet. The war, which so many believed would be won by military might and ocean domination, was in fact being lost in the air. Radio, an insignificant tool in the physical war, had become the most feared battlefield of all, the battlefield of the mind. What began as a simple intercepted signal, a clandestine message transmitted into the heart of the Reich, could no longer be ignored. GS-1, the invisible enemy, had transformed the perception of an entire nation. The final impact: fear and panic. The Kriegsmarine, once an invincible war machine, was beginning to fragment. Derscheff's words, who, with his hoarse, sarcastic voice, seemed to come from within the Reich itself, were no longer seen as British propaganda. They were the truth. Kriegsmarine High Command Report, January 18, 1942. The German Navy faces a new reality. The morale of our crews is at its lowest point. Our strength, built over years, has been torn apart by a voice that comes from inside our minds. It is no longer possible to trust our own orders, not with the psychological effects these transmissions cause. With every broadcast, GS1's psychological effect increased. Now it was no longer just one or two sailors questioning their orders. It was an entire system, an entire nation beginning to wonder if the Reich they knew truly lived up to what it promised.
The final judgment, the mind as weapon. Looking at the collapse of the Kriegsmarine and the growing weariness of the Reich, the true irony of the war of radio waves was revealed. True power was not in the weapons. It was, from the start, in information, in words. While the Reich, with all its military strength, tried to protect its borders and maintain control over its occupied cities, it was collapsing from the inside out. And Hitler's empire, which rested on the absolute control of the minds and bodies of the German people, now found itself defeated by the power of doubt. The radio was our greatest weapon, declared Sefton Delmer, one of GS1's creators, but not a weapon of steel. It was a weapon of words. With control of the mind, the British finally won a war they could not win in the physical field. The sound of thunder. And so, in that late January of 1942, as the war became even more brutal on all other fronts, there was an inescapable reality. Hitler's empire was being destroyed from within, and the invisible enemy, a voice on the radio, finally triumphed. Der Chef's words, spoken with so much contempt and irony at the beginning, now became the truth for many. The men who once marched under the banner of an invincible empire now marched under the shadow of growing doubt. And the voice of the people, represented by the clandestine radio, was stronger than any tank, plane, or submarine. The voice was the ultimate victory. They laughed, they mocked, they ignored. But when the war of radio waves arrived, the sound of their lies was finally silenced. And the sound of the truth mixed with the thunder of defeat. In their ears, in their minds, the great soldiers of the Reich heard for the last time not the roar of victory, but the echo of doubt, of truth, and of invisible defeat. They laughed when they first heard it. They stopped laughing when they realized the sound of laughter was mixing with the thunder of defeat. The thunder spoke, and the sky never belonged to them again. The invisible war ended. But the true war of radio waves, the war for the mind, for the truth, for the power of the word, will never be forgotten. And history, like all true history, is transmitted through the echo of the waves, the power of the voice.